I know the exact place in my parents' kitchen where light always bent a little softer. A strip of June sun that unzipped the day and landed across the countertop, as if to bless whatever small ritual was happening beneath it. 4 years that light illuminated the chipped mug with a blue rim, the dish towel folded into a neat square, the bowl where keys were dumped like coins. I came to understand the house by the ways people moved through it. Ashley's quick, practiced stride, the way she could make conversation and redirect attention at the same time. Dad's deliberate shuffle toward the TV in the afternoons. Mom's careful modulation of tone when she wanted to soften a request. I played my part for a long time. Reliable, they called me. It was supposed to be praise but felt more like assignment. Reliable meant I was the one who loaded the van for moves, who stayed an extra night to watch crying children, who rearranged my schedule without complaint. Reliable meant invisible in the way that good furniture is invisible until it's gone. The promotion was an email with a neat subject line, Senior Clinical Specialist, Raleigh office, and a relocation package attached like a promise. The words felt both ordinary and seismic. That night I sat at the kitchen island where the family often ate, the television murmuring baseball in the background. I pressed send on the group chat the way I always did, terse and factual. Got the job. Moving the 12th. Read receipts filled. Silence followed. Later when I said it aloud. I got a promotion. They're transferring me to Raleigh. I expected the usual chorus. Congratulations, proud mom comments, a laugh from dad. Instead the room hummed with the baseball announcer and the rustle of things that mattered more in that moment. Ashley's phone vibrating with sales alerts, Mom riffling through the calendar for who needed pickup when. No one looked up. My voice evaporated into the air like steam. That silence was not new. It was an old echo made solid by years of practice. It taught me to adjust my expectations downward, to find consolation in small moments. The oven's reassuring click as it preheated, the satisfying crimp of a pie crust, my own ability to compute a schedule down to the minute and know the family's errand pattern like a second language. On moving day I packed the last of my boxes into the U-Haul, shutting the back door with a thud that sounded like finality. For a brief, ridiculous moment I tested whether someone would ask if I'd remembered the sugar, or if someone would stand in the doorway and ask for one last thing. The cabbie's mirror showed my parents' street shrinking behind me while my phone chimed. A photo in the family chat, Ashley's daughter with cherry pie smeared on her face, and a caption, someone couldn't wait. Another ping. Ashley, just hit $2,000 in sales today. New record. I drove until the billboards changed. The highway seemed to make room for me. Mile markers passed like small confidants. I pulled off for gas at a station where a man in a reflective vest offered me a heterodox blessing. New city, new luck. And I accepted it because the phrase felt true even if only by whim. When I arrived in Raleigh the first night, the studio apartment on the 3rd floor felt too small and perfect. Magnolia trees outside the window, light that leaked in like invitation. The landlord smiled, wrote a receipt, and left me with keys that were mine in a way I hadn't felt with any of the keys in Ohio. Work was consummation and paying of a debt I'd been unaware I carried. There were onboarding documents, names to learn, protocols to memorize. There were colleagues who asked me about my weekend not because they needed me to prod the group chat but because they genuinely wanted to know. For the first time in years, my professional accomplishments were not footnotes to someone else's crisis. I presented at department meetings. I received an email praising the clarity of my report. Small acknowledgments stacked into a new scaffolding of self-regard. At first, silence from home felt like punishment. Then it felt like relief. For the first week I called my parents only when I wanted to, and the absence of immediate interruption felt like air. The kind of breathing you do when you've been underwater so long that every inhale feels sacred. I bought a desk lamp, chosen for its warm light, and the barista across the street learned my order. Medium drip, 2 sugars, the kind of small human tax that makes mornings stick. Months passed and the soft architecture I'd built began to show texture. friendships that were reciprocated with invitations and curiosity, a community library where the librarian recommended titles and remembered that I liked history, a dog park where a rambunctious poodle named Toby detonated through the mornings and rewired my sense of ritual. I learned how to cook for one without feeling that it was charity. I learned how to place an ornament and own the space it occupied. Then the texts came. First tentative, later sharper. "We need help with the boutique," Mom wrote. "Ashley's latest vendor is threatening to cancel the winter order. We thought with your promotion maybe." The ellipses of leverage. I set the phone down and felt the old pattern stir. The automatic calculus of how I could rearrange my life to absorb theirs. I had, in the past, stopped my own plans for other people's emergencies. This time I closed the laptop and drafted a single, unadorned response. "I can't help with that right now. I'm building my life here." The anger at my refusal arrived like a seasonal storm. They came to Raleigh a month later under the banner of family. Cake, hugs, plans. They stepped into my living room like owners into a showroom. The girls ran through my apartment the way they always had in my parents' house. Except in my apartment they ran without the habituated expectation that I would stop to clean up behind them. My mother's hug was immediate and suffocating. Dad's eyes kept glancing to the TV as if the presence of a sports game legitimized his stillness. Ashley's gaze tracked my bookshelves and the way a crystal paperweight sat precisely where I had placed it. A gift from a boyfriend whose name my family already knew and judged. They had rehearsed the scene before they arrived. It had a crescendo engineered to produce my capitulation. Financial narratives, urgent pleas, the performance of instability. "You could help with a loan," Mom ventured, voice soft as if she was submitting to humility rather than asking for it. "Your raise could make a big difference in our situation." The word loan sat between us like an accusation. For a heartbeat, I considered illuminating budgets and spreadsheets, demonstrating how my new finances were accounted for. I could have produced a plan, a repayment schedule, and an offer that would have allowed them to label their request as accepted. Instead, something that had been annealing in my chest for months solidified into speech, precise and cool. "No," I said. The room tilted with that single syllable. Dad looked away to the game. Ashley's face contorted. Mom's mouth softened around a practiced expression. I could see in their faces the playbook they'd used on me my whole life. The well-timed sighs, the invocation of being family, the performance of moral obligation. They deployed guilt like currency, confident I would accept its valuation. But something in me had changed. An awareness that my sacrifices did not produce a currency called love. They produced expectation. They left that night with plates that still smelled of the food they'd praised and an air of displeasure that lingered like a storm front. The group chat pinged with comments that tried to justify, cajole, and condemn. The extended family took sides. My cousin posted a message that asked if perhaps I was being hasty, while Aunt Karen sent a message about the moral dangers of refusing your family. What I'd expected at that point was a surge of remorse followed by pleas to mend. Instead the pattern continued. Sporadic apologies followed by more requests. They had not noticed me when I announced my promotion. They noticed now that I had achieved a life they could monetize. Their sudden interest felt like being seen through a lens of utility rather than humanity. I could have collapsed beneath the barrage of requests. I could have authorized a loan that would have purchased a temporary peace in exchange for a lasting resentment. Instead I made a different choice, one that turned out to be complicated, costly, and oddly liberating. I said no more than once, and the answer became a boundary I practiced like a new language. Boundaries are not one-time events. They are muscles you exercise. The first time I refused a request, my chest ached with the old reflex to smooth things over. The second and third refusals were easier. The muscle remembered. Friends I'd made at work became anchors. Book club on Thursdays, a running group on Saturday mornings, a colleague who turned into a real friend and who asked genuine questions about how I was, without expecting the answer to be a down payment on a family emergency. There were, of course, relapses. Every time someone in the family had an urgent problem, a small reflex of my old self would surface. An aunt might text about needing a ride, and my calendar would start to rearrange itself in the quiet of the night. Each time I practiced not giving, the urge lost a little of its force. It was like learning to hold a heavy weight differently. You build core strength, and over time the weight becomes manageable or unnecessary. The longer arc of my life, swollen from those early refusals, took shape in surprising corners. Jackson appeared first as a face across a dog park fence, a man with dark hair flecked with gray who asked about my poodle Toby's habits. He moved in slowly, the opposite of the dramatic romance I'd feared. His curiosity was steady, not centering me as a project or a rescue. He learned the names of the small things I liked, the exact way I took my coffee, the novel I'd been carrying for months. We discovered each other in small increments, shared dog walks, conversations about work that didn't turn into family updates, dinners that sustained themselves with conversation rather than crises. Ashlyn, my cousin, was the first family member to create a bridge instead of a rope. She visited one weekend, sat in the armchair I'd chosen for its curve, and took pictures, casual snapshots that she posted on social media. The attention that followed from extended family was instantaneous. Questions about my neighborhood, implicit assessments of my financial situation. The comments contained a curious mixture: surprise that I could make a home of my own, a suspicion that the facade must hide a secret ledger. They returned again months later, the same old script with new lines. Ashley performed the role of the struggling sister. Financial strain, the looming threat of losing the boutique, the searing moral imperative that family is the safety net you must always use. She asked directly, in a way that had no wiggle room, "Can you help, Willa? We don't have another option." I sat with the question, which by then had become less of a demand and more of a mirror. The answer had to be truthful, not rhetorical. "No," I said again, and this time I added context, not as bargaining chip but as boundary. "I can't be responsible for your business model. I won't underwrite your choices." The reaction was fierce. Tears, indignation, righteous anger. They accused me of being cold, of choosing my own comfort over family duty. The old lines they'd used to shame me, the ones that had worked for decades, felt thin against the woman I had become. My refusal was not merely a denial of money but a demand that they accept me as a person with limits. What surprised me was how quickly the family adapted. The week after the conference of complaints, they rearranged responsibilities, delegated tasks, and carried on. My absence didn't collapse their world. They found babysitters, they called in favors, they charged a credit card and made a plan. The realization landed like a cool hand on my forehead. My presumed indispensability had been a fiction. They could live without me. And so could I. The aftermath of my refusal was complicated. Sometimes the family's mode shifted toward a form of performative contrition that left me suspicious. Apologies that came with strings, visits that asked for reconciliation but that soon returned to old demands. Other times they did genuinely change in small ways. Mom asked about my job, and not as preface to a request. Dad called to talk about the weather and listened when I described my commute. These were small miracles. They were also precarious. 3 years after I left, there was an incident that tested the new terms. Ashley had made a poor decision with an inventory order and found herself with a stack of unpaid bills and a store that might shutter come January. She called with a tremor in her voice that smelled like panic. The instinct to help, the old reflexive kindness, rose up. I examined it like a surgeon examines a tissue and decided instead on a different kind of help. I offered to help her work through a spreadsheet, to vet her vendors and find options she had not considered. It required time, not money. It required patience, not cash. She accepted, more reluctantly than I would have hoped, but she accepted nonetheless. The difference between offering time and offering money turned out to be pivotal. Time required work on their part. Money consumed my boundaries without changing the systems that produced the emergencies. By helping Ashley reconfigure her business model, by teaching her how to track cash flow and negotiate with vendors, I helped her create structures that might reduce the likelihood of repeated crises. It shifted the relationship from dependency to skill building. It felt like an investment rather than a surrender. Of course, these adjustments did not erase decades of habit. There were days of recrimination when the chorus of family grievances rose like a tide. There were instances where I felt myself momentarily reduced to being helpful in need. I would receive messages that threaded old guilt with new manipulation. "If you cared," one message said, "you'd find a way." Those nights were hard. I learned to be patient with the grief that accompanied the old identity morphing away. Gradually, though, things softened in ways I had not anticipated. Mom and I developed a ritual contact, a short weekly call where we spoke about things other than money and obligation, books she'd been reading, her herb garden, a neighbor with too many cats. The calls were not dramatic but steady. They resembled a repaired bridge that didn't pretend it was stronger than it was. Dad began to call more often, and in a voice that, for the first time, asked about my day. He sometimes paused, allowing silence to exist without feeling the need to disrupt it with orders or corrections. Ashley's practice of small apologies became more frequent than grand declarations. The first apology that felt unencumbered, no strings, no implied debts, came with a messy paper card that read, "I'm sorry." Didn't explain. Didn't ask for repayment. That was progress. We didn't return to the old closeness overnight. But we created a new map, a network of interactions that could sustain itself without subsuming me. There were other elements to the story beyond family confrontations. Friendships that deepened, work that grew into new opportunities, and the slow accrual of ordinary joys that had been absent when my identity was wrapped primarily around service. I volunteered once a month at a clinic for folks who had been through injuries and saw how my work in medical devices could translate to someone else's recovery. I traveled to 3 conferences, met bright colleagues, and learned to present myself in a boardroom without translating my worth into care for someone else's drama. Jackson and I built a life that was ordinary in its consistency rather than spectacular in its gestures. We learned to host dinners where no one left with a debt. We planted a small garden on a balcony and argued gently about the best way to stake a tomato. Love revealed itself to be patient in small, domestic ways that I had not expected. He was a mirror without demand, an accomplice in the slow craft of living. The family didn't just wait for me to vanish. They remade themselves. A cousin stepped forward to be Ashley's fiscal accountability partner. Mom took a class in volunteer coordination to fill the time she had previously used to manage other people's problems. My father, who had always been curt with affection, began to send me articles about baseball and little notes that said, simply, "I saw you pitch last week on TV. Good call." These were small proofs that change could be gradual and that different family members could learn new roles. One of the most profound lessons I learned was how to ask for help without the old compulsion to do it silently. Early in my transition, when I was still navigating the strangeness of being my own priority, I started seeing a therapist named Mira. She sat across from me in a small office lined with plants and a bookshelf, and she taught me the vocabulary of boundary setting. Need, limit, non-negotiable. She helped me see that my generosity had been weaponized by the people around me. Not maliciously necessarily, but structurally. We unpacked stories of the past, brought them into the light, and decided together how I might move through them. Therapy helped me recognize my patterns, how I would anticipate everyone's needs as a way of securing love, how I would feel a pervasive anxiety that approval equaled safety. Through that work I learned the difference between giving because I wanted to and giving because I feared abandonment. That fissure in motivation was essential. It guided the choices I now made about when to help and when to refrain. A year into my new life, my mother called late one autumn night. There had been a small emergency. A pipe burst in their basement and the insurer was slow to respond. She was frightened but not desperate in the way she used to be. The tone of her voice was different, tentative and less entitled. We talked about practicalities, not guilt. I offered to help find a contractor and to make the calls I had learned to make in the city. She accepted my help without the theatrical sorrow that had always accompanied similar pleas in the past. It was a small, telling shift. The relationship did not heal with a single act. Instead, it healed with practices. Small calls that were not preludes to requests, invitations that included boundaries, an acceptance of my refusal when it came. The hard truth was that some things would not return. The deep emotional intimacy I'd once hoped for remained limited by decades of pattern. But the abrasion that had once burned in my chest dulled with time. A different kind of connection grew, one that needed maintenance and compassion and a readiness to walk away if old, parasitic patterns reappeared. By the third year after I left, the family dynamic resembled less a hostage drama and more a negotiated treaty. I had my days of relapse, times I wanted to give more or felt the tug of guilt, but increasingly I could step back and check the motivations behind my impulses. I had the rare experience of choosing myself without guilty aftercare. I realized that choosing yourself is not always an act of abandonment but often one of self-preservation that allows you to show up in the world as who you truly are. A few years later, at a small lakeside reunion, Mom and I sat on the dock while the sun translated itself into gold across the water. She turned to me with a face that had been softened by years and said, "I don't want to lose you." Her voice was small and honest, stripped of the theatrical sorrow that had once been her armor. "You never had me to lose," I said. "You had someone you could always call. Maybe you didn't notice the difference." Her breath hitched. She sat with that for a long minute, as if turning over a new map. "I am learning," she admitted. "Not everyone learns, and not every relationship is salvageable. But many of them are possible to reshape." For me, rebuilding meant inventing new rituals. Weekly calls with Mom that ended without a ledger. Dinners where Ashley could be a sister, not an applicant. Afternoons with a cousin who became a friend. It meant creating boundaries that protected my life while allowing space for limited vulnerability. Over time, I found that the life I had built was not a monument to stubbornness but a place of small pleasures. Toby's early morning nudges, Jackson's dry humor, a library book that carried me through a long winter, an email from a colleague praising a report I had written. The triumph was quiet. It was the ability to say no and still inhabit the world with affection. It was the knowledge that my worth was not equivalent to the number of favors I would do for someone else. If you asked me whether I regretted the flight, the unanswered announcement, the thud of the U-Haul's closing door, I would answer with a clarity that has taken time to arrive. I do not regret the leaving. I regret the years of waiting, years I spent proving myself by service. I regret the times when I did not defend my small self from being consumed by larger appetites because I believed that usefulness would become love. Did not. But the life I built was not a life of retaliation. It was a life of careful curation. I learned to feed myself first. I learned to accept help without fear. I built a network of friends who wanted me because I existed, not because I could fix them. I learned to be grateful for the banal pleasures that used to feel illicit. An afternoon nap that belonged only to me. A Sunday afternoon where the only person I had to please was myself. When my mother called last week and said simply, "Thank you," it landed like something that had finally been earned. "Thank you for not disappearing," she added after a pause. She sounded more like someone building muscles of apology than someone who had come to me with a list of demands. "You're welcome," I said, and this time the words were not an obligation. They were an observation. I let the warmth of gratitude sit in me for a minute, an odd domestic pleasure I had once traded away. If you were me, if your family had ignored you until your life became a resource, you would have options that are hard and kind. Walk away entirely, and perhaps never forgive. Create a fence and let people come to you on terms you set. Offer time, not money. Teach skills instead of paying invoices. The choice has cost. The right choice is the one you can live with. The hardest thing is not stopping the waiting. It is stopping the counting. How many grievances did you absorb, and how much of your life did you spend proving your worth? I stopped counting. I started living. In the end, absence taught me a language of presence. By leaving, I did not become unloving. I became available on my own terms. I rebuilt a life where I existed not as a convenience but as an entity with needs and desires and a calendar I could shape. The people I love have learned, imperfectly and slowly, that I belong to myself first. They may never fully adopt the new vocabulary of boundaries. They may regress and ask again. But now, when they ask, I have the vocabulary to answer. The world has not ended. The games have been played and the scripts revised. Sometimes my phone still buzzes with a plea. Sometimes I still feel the old pangs. But increasingly, I sit with my own response.